Okay, time to start writing the model. So the first step within this is to plan all the possible paragraphs that pupils may write when they write an answer to this question. And this does require you to be quite strict about what you're going to expect them to write about. I think when I first started teaching history, I had a really kind of flexible idea of it because history is huge and the schema is huge. But I found that by doing that, I often didn't know the exact direction I wanted things to go in, and that meant that writing ended up being quite shallow because I didn't know where I wanted them going. So I've sketched out possible paragraphs. There are 3 possible paragraphs that I think will come out of this lesson as a result of the teaching I'm planning to do. So, 1 paragraph about the consequences of Russia leaving the war after the Russian Revolution, and 2 possible paragraphs about the USA entering the war and the effect of that. So let's go through these one at a time. A bit of a Blue Peter moment because I have already drawn out these flowcharts, I suppose they are. So Russia leaving the war leaves Germany fighting on fewer fronts. That potentially could mean that they had a stronger Western front, and that potentially could lead to a successful offensive. I've included there a note about the spring offensive. Now, I know that some historians talk about the delays in the peace talks between Germany and Russia and the effect that had on the spring offensive. I may choose to explore that, but if I do, I'm probably going to explore that with my real top end. In terms of the USA entering the war, I've now split that out into 2. 1 paragraph about supplies and 1 paragraph about troops. So, when the USA entered the war, that would mean that the Allies would generally be better supplied, and if they're better supplied, then they're going to be better equipped, and the troops are going to be better fed, so they're going to have higher morale and higher stamina, and that could lead to more successful offensives from the Allies. Now, I've said careful here, as I've talked about this idea of linking to tactics and talking about the Somme as well, and the impact of things like machine gun fire or artillery. It doesn't matter how well fed a soldier is if they're going up against a machine gun. So we do need to be a little bit careful with that one, that we don't accidentally encourage pupils to end up saying, oh, well, they were well fed and therefore they won the war. And then on the other side, we have this idea of more troops. So more troops means a larger fighting force, and that then connects back up. It could mean that offensives that are already being planned would be successful, but it also means the possibility for multiple possible offences. But for that, I'm going to need an example. So from this, I'm also starting to sketch out exactly what knowledge I'm going to need to include in my input, in my reading, which I'm going to talk about later on. So I took the planning of my chains of reasoning and I used it to write 1 paragraph. Now, you could write a model of all 3 of these, but really, this is plotting out the knowledge, and when I write the model paragraph, I'm mainly focusing on structure. So, we put this to one side and put this up. I also point out quite how thrilled I am that I decided to take my visualizer home before lockdown. It's been an absolute lifesaver. Okay, so this is my model paragraph. I've literally just written it, printed out. I haven't done anything else with it because I want to take you through the process of what I do with it once I've written it. It can often be really, really tempting to just write it and say, lovely, bish, bash, bosh, model done, and move on. My experience is that when I've done that and I've not done the step that I'm about to do, I often find that I'm going through it with the kids if we're looking at a model after or beforehand, and I'll end up improving my work on the fly, which can be really overwhelming for students. So, one event in 1917 which contributed to the end of the stalemate on the Western Front was the USA's decision to join the war with France and Britain. So this is me improving the paragraph, but this is also me explaining why this is good. So I've derived my sentence from the question. And this is me thinking really carefully about problems that I've encountered as I've been teaching history over the last few years. And unfortunately, this is something I'm going to be saying a lot, I can preempt quite a few things because I've seen them happen before, because I've gone wrong or I've seen it go wrong on multiple occasions. One thing that I've noticed with a lot of pupils is that quite often they'll answer the question they want to answer, and quite often that question is a lot easier than the one that I've given them. And I can remember doing it when I was at school. Really good way to kind of force students down that route. I talk about it like herding cats. So force students down that route is to get them to have that first sentence really closely linked to the question, so that they're not just saying aha 1917 and describing what happened, but they're really closely answering what they've been told to answer. Okay, so the sentence has been derived from the question. I also need to point out here, when I'm explaining it to my pupils, if I choose to do it beforehand, depending on the group, that there are multiple possible routes that this opening sentence could go down. It could go down the supplies route, it could go down the troops route, but I want to keep them separate because they ultimately lead to slightly different consequences. It's worth noting as well that even though this is an opening sentence, and in old parlance we might talk about this being the P of PEE, I don't really like those really formulaic structures to paragraphs. I tend to talk about it in terms of focus, what happened, why that was important, but there are going to be different paragraph structures for different paragraphs. What's important is that there's a chain of reasoning and that there's evidence to prove that that actually happened. And what order that goes in doesn't really matter so long as it's logical. Okay, so they've got that opening sentence. It's a sentence that's been derived from the question they've actually been asked, and pupils need to be aware of the fact that with that point they could go down multiple possible routes, but they're only going to pick one. This, according to my usual structure, is now the what actually happened bit. The American government declared war on Germany in April 1917, shortly after it discovered Germany's plans to ally with Mexico against the USA. Although the USA had been neutral before 1917, they'd already been transporting supplies to the Allies. However, after they declared war on Germany, the American government was also free to send troops to fight in Europe. Okay, so this is arguably the what happened bit, and actually I think there are some bits that we can cut. Again, this is from experience. So one issue that I've seen in the past is pupils answering the question they want to answer. The second issue is what I call knowledge vomit, where it's, 1917, I'm just going to throw absolutely everything that I know onto the page. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to encourage pupils to really carefully select the facts that they use, because the facts that they select are going to demonstrate their comprehension of the events. If they're just throwing everything on there, it doesn't tell you anything. I would argue that this whole bit about why the USA declared war on Germany is largely irrelevant. We need to know that they declared war in 1917. We need to know that they had been neutral before 1917. If we don't include that, then I think we run the risk of massively over-egging the contribution. Not necessarily over-egging, but making it sound as though it was nothing and then everything all at once. Whereas we need to demonstrate, and pupils need to demonstrate, that it was a much more subtle increase. Although subtle perhaps even isn't the right word. Either way. So we're going to leave that in. But this section here, I would argue, is knowledge vomit. And I think it's one of those things where if I hadn't checked through my model and decided that I just needed to cut that, I would have ended up cutting it in front of the class, which on the one hand would have shown that even I revise my work as I go, but on the other hand, particularly if you've got a lower prior retaining group, might massively overwhelm them. Okay, so we've got down to the American government being free to send troops to fight in Europe, and that's our what happened. What we should now see, if we're going by the structure I usually end up subconsciously using, is that this section here should then be why that was important, or the consequences of it. Although American troops didn't arrive in Europe until 1917, okay, so that's probably a bit more what happened, the increased number of troops available to the Allies meant they had a larger and stronger fighting force with which to resist the German spring offensive and to launch the successful counter-offensive in 1918. So this is something that I talk to students about as being a chain of reasoning. So this happened, therefore this happened, therefore this happened, therefore this happened. Whereas quite often I will find that, again, I'm full of phrases that pupils will try and do a Wile E. Coyote. They will try to go from more troops arrived, therefore the counter-offensive was successful, without bridging that gap, and so they fall flat on their face. So I'm probably going to talk about this idea of a Wile E. Coyote paragraph while I'm going through this section, the importance of having a staged chain of reasoning. Particularly, I want to ask the question of why does an increased number of troops lead to successful offensives or successful defence? So a stronger fighting force or a larger fighting force, one that's got more stamina, one that can resist attacks because troops can be replaced. But this is a discussion that I know I'm probably going to need to have in class before pupils start writing their paragraphs. This is also flagged up to me a few bits of vocabulary that I'm going to need to make sure pupils know before they start writing. They're going to need to know offensive and counter-offensive. They're also going to need to understand neutral, which will feed into my reading that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I've got a clear opening statement that is derived from the question. I have concise, relevant knowledge that avoids knowledge vomit. That then leads into a relevant chain of reasoning, which has been carefully stepped to answer the question. So I now know why this is good, or at least why I think this is good. But in writing this, what I've also started to do, and this kind of links into the planning on the squared paper you've seen as well, is I'm starting to get a really clear idea of what I need to include in my input and what I need to avoid. This is a really good example. I do want to include this. I don't want to start my reading by just saying, oh, and by the way, the USA joined the war in 1917. Not going to tell you why, just deal with it. It's important that pupils understand the narrative, but I'm not going to spend 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining that because that's not the focus of this lesson. The focus of the lesson is the consequences of these events, not why they happened in the first place. Downplay is the wrong word. Don't emphasize. Causes. I'm going to need to talk about the size of America's population, the size of its economy, in order for students to understand the real significance of the USA joining the war. I need to talk about this idea of neutrality, so that pupils aren't saying that it's it's a nothing and then everything approach. What the USA actually supplied. And in terms of like specific facts, because I want to make sure that there are specific examples. Like when I originally wrote this, I toyed with just making a generic statement like they would be able to resist offensives, or offensives would be more likely to be successful, which is what we saw in that squared paper. But that all strikes me as a little bit woolly. I want them to have a specific example that they can use. So I am going to need to include the spring offensive and also the counter-offensive in 1918. But with those, I'm probably going to want to separate them from the input that focuses on this. Otherwise, I'm going to end up just repeating myself in multiple paragraphs because we've got those 2 stems. So this all kind of harks back to a really, really key piece of advice that I was given when I was training. As I said, I was a languages teacher. I taught French, and my knowledge of French was really, really rudimentary. And I can remember my PGCE mentor at the time, who went on to be my NQT mentor, telling me to work backwards. She said, write your model first and then plan backwards from there. And I've really taken that to heart, and I think it gives my lessons a lot more direction. So I've got my model, I know why my model's good, hopefully, and from that model I'm starting to pull out what I'm going to focus on, what I'm not going to focus on, and this is going to help me to start shape my reading. Now at the same time, and I'm going to talk about this in the next section, it's really important that my reading isn't just the answer to this question. I'm not trying to get pupils to parrot back exactly what I've written. I'm trying to get them to make that jump. Essentially, the reading should be me taking them to the edge of the cliff, and then they need to be able... Oh yes, they need to be able to build the bridge across the cliff on their own. And what you tend to find is that some students are going to merrily go along with you to the edge of the cliff and then stop, and when they're on their own they'll refuse to go any further. Some students are just going to try and jump it all in one, but if you guide them properly then they should build that bridge across. So that's what we're going to do when we look at how we're going to create the input in order to build towards this paragraph, and that's our next section.